So I hope you're all doing okay, safe, and not getting too down about being confined and having a lot of usual activities be tough. We're getting close to the end of the semester, and this is one of the lectures just going over the practice exam. So before you watch this, you should try to do both practice exams. This is actually only about the last year's second in-class exam. And let's get to it. Okay, so we start with a bunch of quite a few questions that are critical reading questions, and so as usual, you're trying to think of things, you know. Hopefully you really thought through all the things that were mentioned there. This one actually, this first one is slightly easier. So it has to do with knowing which things are considered something bad and something good. So most economists talk about the fact that inflation helps reduce the friction from nominal wage cuts being difficult. And so another way of describing that is making real wage cuts go down more easily. And getting wages right is an important part of the price system. And of course, people never like their wages to go down. But if that's if that's necessary to avoid having people be fired, or even more likely to avoid having additional people hired, to avoid getting in the way of the company hiring additional people, then it might be important to make real wage cuts to go down more easily. Things that definitely are bad are messing with the minds of legislators, messing with our minds, that is, making us make mistakes like not saving enough for retirement, messing with the price system more generally. And here it's like people would just be, the danger is that by messing with the price system, people end up using the wrong varieties of things in the wrong amounts, which leads to an important type of inefficiency in formal models of monetary policy. This messing with the price system and people using the wrong varieties is actually a surprisingly big deal numerically. Okay, now you can see most people got this, but some people thought none of them were benefits, and that's pretty understandable. You'd have to really have read the article, The Costs of Inflation, to get straight that economists talk about making real wage cuts going down easily is considered a benefit. Okay, so question number two, which of the following is not a quotation from Odious Wealth? The outrage is not so much over inequality, but all the dubious ways the rich got richer. So here it was very important to pursue the critical reading approach of noticing whether you agreed or not, or disagreed, because I certainly took some unusual views in this piece, and unless you noticed that those were unusual views that maybe you disagreed with, you wouldn't be able to even know what I said or what the arguments were. And what's A here? Well, wealth obtained by decades-long copyrights on songs and books is an excellent example of legitimate wealth. Here, in the actual piece, I was saying the opposite. I was saying on efficiency grounds, it's really too bad if we don't have more free access to books that are 30 years old or whatever, and that really wouldn't affect the incentives of the authors very much, because honestly they get most of their sales in the first few years, and it's also early sales then put money in the bank or in the stock market that earns interest. So in a lot of ways it's really the sales in the early years that are important, and it wouldn't take away the incentives from artists and writers and so on much at all to curtail their copyrights, 25 years later, even 15, even 10 or 15 years later. Let's see some of the other things that were quotations. B, while in some cases the principles for whether wealth is deserved or not are obvious, in other cases they are quite subtle. Well, what we just talked about is an example. Wealth obtained by deceit is illegitimate. I do think that, and I did say that. And I was explaining the words odious wealth. Michael Kramer and Seema Jayachandran were talking about odious debt, that maybe if a bad government goes into debt, maybe the people of that country shouldn't owe that money after the government is thrown out. And the way you make this, so that it doesn't get in the way of good loans is you have to have the international community declare in advance that a regime is illegitimate and debts that it incurs should not be respected. And so it's actually, I find it very intriguing because I think it's a very powerful economic sanction. We tell Iran, people, we have say, let's not trade with Iran in order to punish Iran for being still kind of interested in nuclear weapons and certainly interested in missiles and so on, and which plus interested in causing other mischief in the Middle East. So, but to say, for many governments, saying, look, we're going to make it hard for you to borrow, because if you do borrow, that money doesn't have to be paid back. So anybody would be a fool to lend to you, because the money wouldn't have to be paid back as far as the international community is concerned. So there's a very interesting economic sanction. I think it should be put in place. All right. Let's go on to 3. This is about gather round children. Here's how to heal a wounded economy. What was something I said and what was in the opposite direction. Let's go to the one that was the opposite direction. Let's go to the one that I didn't say. When there's too much money running around in the economy starts to sink like a ship that's overloaded. Well, that's not the metaphor at all. The metaphor is for inflation. And so in the story, I talk about inflation like a balloon inflating and floating up and going off. So that was, and the economy gets stimulated by a lot of money. It does cause inflation, but I think a stimulated economy doesn't sound much like a metaphor of sinking. What are some of the things that I did in fact say? A few years ago, people got scared and wanted to keep their money safe. The government said it would keep their money safe as long as they kept the money locked away inside doing nothing. The point of this is to show just the stupidity of allowing people to just park their money in paper currency, or for that matter, in reserve accounts earning zero when we need them to make loans. If you allow interest rates to go negative, then they'll be incentivized to make loans. The C about where Ben the Money Master said, Ben the Money Master, of course, is Ben Bernanke, said less prints, more money, but the new money stayed inside sitting in the corner. That's about low velocity. And then D, money needs to go outside, run around and play. The giant piles of money doing nothing start to shrink. That's negative interest rates. And of course, they're not all quotations because of B. Okay, let's go on to number 4. Which one, again, you have to use your critical reading skills, which is what I said and which is the opposite. These are long quotations. Let's go to the one that's not what I said. Sinning by having GDP above the natural level is a good idea even if it has to be coupled with repenting by having GDP below the natural level at another time. The benefits of being above the natural level of output are greater than the costs of being below it. And, it's easier to drive inflation down by being below the natural level of output than it is to drive inflation up by being above the natural level of output. I definitely didn't say that. And in general, economists think that fluctuations are probably unpleasant, and it's kind of the opposite of this, that being, being below the natural level of output some of the time and above some of the time is probably less pleasant than just being at the natural level of output all the time. And it could well be that it takes a lot more unemployment to bring inflation down than, less unemployment, low unemployment to get inflation up. Okay, I think I won't go over all the things that I did say, but let's go on to number 5. Okay, which of the following is not a quotation from subordinating paper currency to electronic money can end recessions and end inflation? This is one of the first things I wrote about negative interest rate policy. What is the thing I didn't say? As a society, we want paper currency to be a good store of wealth over the long haul. I definitely don't think that, because then if paper currency were a good store of wealth and always earned a good return, then people would just pile up paper currency when we need them to go out and build factories and buy equipment and build houses, do things like that. Okay, and then of course there are a lot of things that I did say that are pretty interesting, but let me move on so this doesn't get too lengthy. Okay. Oh, good. We have some shorter quotations or non-quotations here. Question 6. Which of the following is not a quotation from America's big monetary policy mistake, how negative interest rates could have stopped the Great Recession in its tracks? The other thing I didn't say was it's never right to do anything that hurts savers. Now, savers seem to be in good repute in our country, but when we're in a deep recession, we need people to spend. When in good times, we need people to save more, but in bad times, we save more so it can build up the capital stock, all the things we talked about in chapters 8 and 9. But in bad times, when it's a big recession, we need people to save more. And in those times, it's appropriate to penalize them with negative interest rates. Let's see the things that I did say. These are pretty interesting. Interference with those price signals lowers the IQ of the invisible hand, this competition that naturally guides markets. So I like this metaphor of price signals, the price system being helping to make the market smarter, the economy smarter. Okay, B, if interest rates are too low, the imbalance will cause the economy to overheat and generate inflation. If interest rates are too high, the imbalance will cause the economy to fall into a recession. So that's pretty straightforward. C, short-run movements in interest rates are tangled up with money supply and demand. In practice, that means that central banks, such as the Federal Reserve, choose interest rates. So there are people who talk about having the quote-unquote free market without any interference from the Federal Reserve or other central bank determine interest rates. But I've never understood that. I've never figured out what they could possibly mean, except saying we should do a gold standard, which is a truly awful idea. I mean, the gold standard is also a monetary policy, and I'm sorry, it's a bad monetary policy that really puts a straitjacket on things. Keeping keeping aggregate demand equal to the natural level of output. Now, there's a good monetary policy, and and short of something like a gold or silver or commodity standard, like a gold standard, I really don't know how you have interest rate determination that's where it doesn't have a central bank in the picture. I guess it's logically possible, but no one's explained this to me adequately. All right, let's go on to 7. Oh, sorry. Oh, great. Now, this is something that, remember, I have in a separate video because I did it on the giant Post-it note. So we'll skip over all of these. They are in the other video. So I do these ones together with the similar types of questions that were on the final last year. Okay, so let's jump ahead to 11. Ignoring minor things if necessary, the monetary base consists of paper currency and coins plus reserves. That's the answer. And I've got some wrong answers, but that's clearly what it is: paper currency and reserves. And paper currency, in class I've mainly said paper currency plus reserves, but even though it's not literally paper, I've always intended to include coins as well as paper currency. Also, I say paper currency slightly metaphorically because I think, if I remember right, that United Kingdom money is actually made out of plastic now instead of paper. So, but I'm calling it paper currency anyway, even if it includes coins or things that look like, paper currency, but in fact are made of plastic. So let me just say paper currency plus reserves, but you got to understand paper currency is a little bit of a loose description. On to question 12. As depicted in lecture, the supply curve for the monetary base is vertical. You can see the picture there. What about the demand curve for the monetary base? Question 13. Downward sloping to the left and flat to the right. Okay, that was pretty straightforward. On to question 14. Right now, in accordance with supply and demand for the monetary base, and relative to any prominent features in the curves, the monetary base is very large, and interest rates such as the federal funds rate and treasury bill rate are close to the interest rate on reserves. That's how it works. And there was a brief time, can't remember how long ago it was, 9 months ago or something, when briefly we were on the upward sloping part of the curve, but the Fed treated that as like, oh, this is a mistake. And then they promptly tried to get onto the flat part of move the base supply, monetary supply of the monetary base to the right, so they could get on the flat part of the demand for the monetary base curve. Flat part, of course, being where extra dollars are just stuffed into reserves, and the downward sloping part being where people are really eager for some paper currency or possibly even need some required reserves. This flat part is beyond the required reserves and beyond any kind of high value uses of paper currency. Now, remember again, some of the high value uses of paper currency have to do with tax evasion and doing other illegal stuff like the drug trade. So, just because it's illegal doesn't mean it's unimportant for thinking about how interest rates are determined. It matters. The illegal demand for paper currency is part of what you have to be aware of when when you're trying to understand why you're still on the downward sloping part of the monetary base demand or why you're on the flat part. Okay, on to question 15. If the price elasticity of demand is equal to 11, then the desired markup ratio will be closest to, and here you basically do, 11 is epsilon, you do epsilon over epsilon minus 1, so that's 11 over 11 minus 1, 11 tenths, which is 1.1. And you can see, fortunately, that was a pretty easy question given the exercises people did. And I want to really, really stress the importance of doing the exercises that I posted. I've given you links to exercises, for example, about how changing various things can affect the steady state level of the capital and capital and output in the solar growth model. And there are going to be problems where, or questions on the exam where if you've done that problem set, and it'll give you a lot of practice and things ought to seem relatively easy. And if you haven't done that exercise, it'll seem ridiculously hard. So don't miss out on those exercises. Okay, 16. If the price elasticity of demand equals 3, then the desired markup ratio will be closest to, well, we've got 3 halves, 3 over 3 minus 2. 3 halves is 1.5. And, of the available answers, 1.4 is closest. I think I might have had 1.5 in an answer F, but there's no answer F allowed. So I edited on the spot, and I'm always glad in those situations to have this closest to language, because it allows there to be a correct answer, even if I, in effect, made a drafting error, as I did here. I clearly made a drafting error. And of course, if two numbers are equally close, go to the algebraically largest number. So I set up that policy partly for the sake of these drafting errors. Okay, on to question 17. The force that pushes toward marginal cost and marginal revenue being equal, guess what? That's price adjustment. When a monopolist chooses a price, they choose a price such that marginal cost and marginal revenue are equal. A price that delivers a quantity at which marginal cost and marginal revenue are equal is a somewhat more detailed way of thinking about it. But marginal cost doesn't equal marginal revenue automatically. It only equals marginal cost. Marginal cost only equals marginal revenue because of price adjustment. And if you're in the short run and prices haven't had a chance to adjust, guess what? Marginal cost might not equal marginal revenue. And for example, as I've emphasized, in that situation where marginal cost isn't equal to marginal revenue product is not a good concept. You need marginal cost product. Obviously, marginal cost product is the same thing as marginal revenue product when marginal cost and marginal revenue are equal. But when they're not equal, it's marginal cost product that's the good concept, not marginal revenue product. So that's kind of an error in economics textbooks, that they emphasize marginal revenue product when they should be giving a little bit. They should be giving at least equal billing to marginal cost product, which pretty much isn't talked about at all. Not good. Okay, question 18. The force that pushes toward average cost and price being equal is free entry and exit of firms. If price is above average cost, then you can make a profit, because profit is equal to quantity times price minus average cost. The amount produced, that kind of quantity, times, in parentheses, price minus average cost. Whereas if price is below average cost, you're making a loss, so you get exit. So the only way you're not going to have a tendency towards either exit or entry is if price equals average cost. And we could go through the details of how, if price is above average cost and there's entry, well, entry tends to push down price until it's equal to average cost by enough entry. And if price is below average cost, exit tends to push up price. If you've got people leaving the industry, then the fewer ones left can bring up their price. Okay, on to question 19. Assume that marginal revenue equals marginal cost and average cost equals price. That's the equilibrium situation in the market. Let's see, what is it? Returns to scale and imperfect competition in market equilibrium. If you have that long-run equilibrium situation, and the degree of returns to scale is 2, the desired markup ratio must be closest to, well, guess what? I hope you actually learn this equation here, and sometimes I've done it flipped left and right. That's not a big difference, but we've got the returns to scale, which is average cost over marginal cost. Average cost in the long run equilibrium equals price, and marginal cost equals marginal revenue. Therefore, average cost over marginal cost equals price over marginal revenue. And remember, the Y is in question 17 and 18, but at any rate, this is true. But price over marginal revenue is the desired markup ratio, mu, which is price elasticity of demand over price elasticity of demand minus 1. But desired markup ratio is the mu, which equals the gamma. So if degree of returns to scale is 2, so is the desired markup ratio. The reason I love this equation is because it says how much returns to scale you have is equal to how much departure from imperfect competition you have. The desired markup ratio is a pretty good measure of just how far you are from perfect competition. If it's 2, you're way far away from perfect competition. If it's 1.1, it's not perfect competition, but you're starting to get close. If it's up, you could have ridiculously large numbers too, but even 2, if you end up having price be double marginal revenue, that's pretty darn far from perfect competition. All right, moving on to question 20. Assume we're in this long run equilibrium. Marginal revenue equals marginal cost and average cost equals price. Then if the degree of returns to scale is 1.2 and marginal cost is $10 per unit, the price must be closest to, and again, just write out this equation and then you plug things in. What do we know? Well, let's see what we know. We know that marginal cost is $10 per unit. So I've got average cost over marginal cost of $10 per unit. Then we've got degree of returns to scale is 1.2. Average cost over marginal cost is equal to degree of returns to scale. And in order to make, I just say, what do I have to put over 10 to make the ratio be 1.2? That's $12 per unit. All right. Not a super hard question. You can see how, if you didn't know this stuff, this would be really hard. But if you know the stuff and you write out the equation, then you start filling in what you know, it's not so bad. All right, 21. The most important practical message of the classical dichotomy can be stated in terms of what the Fed can and can't do in the short run and the long run. Note that the real interest rate is tied to many other real variables. Which of the following is correct? And I think I'm surprised this isn't mentioned in the blog post on this, but maybe because I wrote that just after the class was over in 2019. The Fed can control the nominal interest rate and through it in the short run. This is good to get straight. In the short run, the Fed can control the nominal interest rate and through it the real interest rate, but can't control inflation. So we actually use that when we were talking about international finance in the short run. Long run, Fed can control inflation and through it the nominal interest rate, but can't control the real interest rate. I can't emphasize to you how important this is. Still, people will say, if the interest rates are low, how can the Fed be doing that to the pension funds? Well, guess what? The pension funds are care about the long run real interest rate, which is beyond the Fed's control. And, like maybe if you have a long recession, you're going to bring down the real interest rate, but that's not a very attractive way to influence the long run real interest rate. If you're doing your job and keeping output at the natural level by keeping aggregate demand equal to the natural level of output, you really don't have any control over the real interest rate. And, you can't really, it's really tough to push the real interest rate up above the level determined by supply and demand for loanable funds in the long run without causing a ton of inflation. And that inflation might in turn do weird things to the real interest rate. During your hyperinflation, weird stuff can happen. Okay. Question 22. What's an example of a real variable? Well, let's talk through why the others are nominal too. Price of bread in dollars and cents. So nominal variables are usually expressed in dollars. Number of steel ingots produced per year is, wow, that sounds like a real variable. How many bananas you'd give up to have enough money to buy an apple? Well, that's a real variable because bananas are real, they're not monetary, and apples are real, and so this ratio is also real. The number of houses is also real, so more than one of the above is real. So, of course, these are kind of hard questions because you're tempted to just stop after you find one real thing, but if there's a possible answer, more than one of the above, you have to keep going. Okay, question 23. During the Great Recession and its aftermath, C, the monetary base increased dramatically, but velocity V and the money multiplier M fell. Now, if you think of supply and demand for the monetary base, it's pretty easy to understand that. At some point, the demand for the monetary base is flat, and no matter how much you have, it's not going to change the interest rate much because it just all gets absorbed into reserves. And money sitting around in reserves, not being used for transactions, just drags down velocity. I mean, the money multiplier fell because, that those low interest rates also made it so that banks weren't, let's see, what did they do? Low interest rates would have made it easier to just keep a lot of paper currency, for example, because you're earning almost the same in the bank, and high amounts of paper currency reduce velocity. Now, I have to say, relative to how I taught in 2019, I'm finding myself getting less and less interested in the money supply. I really think you can just think about the monetary base and forget about other measures of the money supply. And that's what my lecture is about, thinking about the Great Depression in terms of supply and demand for the monetary base were all about. The traditional stories all focus on the money supply, but I've come to think that you don't need to think about the money supply in terms of other measures. Just think about the monetary base. So anyway, that money multiplier, I'm getting less and less interested in it because the money multiplier is just, the ratio between other measures of the money supply and the monetary base. And if I stop caring about other measures of the money supply and only care about the monetary base, I stop caring about the money multiplier too. So, that is a different viewpoint than most macroeconomists who are quite interested in the money supply still. But I think the viewpoint, thinking about the monetary base, really works. All right, on to question 24. Treating actual inflation as equal to expected inflation, what's the real interest rate? If the nominal interest rate is 2% per year and inflation is 2% per year, well, you just take, this is the equation, R equals I minus pi, plug in 2% per year for I and pi, and the difference is 0. Question 25. Treating actual inflation as equal to expected inflation, what does inflation need to be to make the real interest rate equal to minus 4% if the nominal interest rate is 0? So this is quite relevant because maybe you need a minus 4% real interest rate to get the aggregate demand that the economy needs. And here, the relevance of this question is we're imagining a central bank that's not willing to use negative interest rates. So they want to use inflation instead. If they had inflation of 4% per year, then it could work. What I did was to find that number was rearrange this equation R equals I minus pi to pi equals I minus R, and then I just plug in 0 for I, and then R is minus 4%, so minus 4%. But you can also see this works. I minus pi, 0 minus 4% is going to deliver a minus 4% real interest rate if I have inflation of 4%. And there are quite a few economists who are advocating that the Fed should have a higher inflation target precisely to open up the possibility of low real interest rates without having to have negative nominal rates. Now, mostly they're assuming negative nominal rates are really hard, which I argue is not the case. And so I don't think we need to go this inflation route. But, you know, it's a judgment call, and there are smart economists who think higher inflation would be better than using negative interest rates. I don't agree with them, but it's an important viewpoint. Okay. Let's see how much we've got left. Okay, this is the last page. We've got several more questions. Here, to be honest, it's, I don't want to be depressing, but I'm not super excited with these questions. They're also not going to appear on this final, so I think I'll mostly cut it short, but let me say just a few words about them. There are some good things to learn. First of all, the model of chapter 3 is really important for understanding the classical dichotomy. In what way do we think that we can determine all the real things without even thinking much about money? And so that is important. And you know, I debate with myself about just how much emphasis to put on chapter 3, but I've come around to the view that you really need to understand it a little bit to see just how different it is from the short run model. You know, principles of macro classes are taught in many different ways, but it's possible that some of you were in a class that really emphasized the short run so much that you didn't fully realize how dramatically different the long run is. So in the long run, we've got these equations, and so I won't go through all 5 questions, but we've got these equations that say changes in the capital stock and changes in labor get multiplied by the marginal products to get the change in output. So in my imagery, it's a kind of mechanical determination of output. You know, it's how much can be produced from that much capital and labor, and then that determines the output. So it's a very supply side picture of the determination of output, if you will. I mean, things happen on the demand side, but it's mainly prices adjusting, particularly the real interest rate adjusting to make demand equal to supply. So supply of output is what it is, given K and L. And then interest rate just adjusts until it can bring demand down or demand up to equal the supply. You know, that's kind of what the central bank should be doing in the short run too. But the standard long run model says, regardless of what the central bank does, it happens in the long run. If the central bank is doing its job and getting aggregate demand to equal the natural level of output, then the short run looks more like the long run. That the better a job you do at monetary policy, the more the short run looks like the long run. Okay, so in the long run, the amount of output is determined by the amount of capital and labor, and that's, you can do that with changes, and it's kind of cool that you can multiply by the marginal product of capital and the marginal product of labor. So then I calculate that in these different cases. Then the next thing we do is talk about consumption. Consumption, you know, I had an arrow with a plus for the effect of GDP on consumption, and GDP, of course, is also people's income. And if we want to make it quantitative, we just multiply by the marginal propensity to consume. You know, there's an intercept term too, but when we're talking about changes, that intercept term is canceling out. It's really just the change in output times the marginal propensity to consume. But taxes also have an effect on consumption. We gotta have minus the change in taxes times marginal propensity to consume. So we can determine that. And then, you know, if y equals c plus I plus g, note, closed economy, then delta I, then we can rearrange to say I equals y minus c minus g, and then do that in change form. Delta I equals delta y minus delta c minus delta g. And of course, in a closed economy, I equals S, say total quantity of saving, equals quantity of investment. So delta I equals delta S. And so you can compute those. And so the last thing I want to say here is it's really crucial to do the equations in this order. And I think the fact that it's crucial to do the equations in this order is really tells you something about the structure of the economy in the long run. So basically, the amount produced is determined by capital and labor. That is the first bedrock fact in the long run here. And we're making life a little easier in the model of chapter 3 by having capital and labor be exogenous. But, you know, these equations would basically hold even if they were endogenous. It's just the delta K and delta L would be a lot more complicated to figure out. So total output you determine, then you figure out how much is going to be consumed, and then what's left over after you consume and you do government purchases is invested. And so that picture of if we consume more or we do more government purchases, we're going to invest less is pretty important. And it's actually crucial for understanding the solo growth model. So this is, you know, when we first learned chapter 3, you didn't know about the solo growth model, but you do know about it now. And the solo growth model really is depending on keeping the capital stock up at a decently high level by not consuming too much and not doing too many government purchases. You know, sometimes people who are fixated on the short run say, oh no, if you consume less, you have less government purchases, you won't have enough aggregate demand. Well, that's easy to fix. Cut the interest rate, you're going to get more aggregate demand. You know, it's you know, you can cut government purchases, you can increase saving by, let's say, retirement saving policy, and then you just cut interest rates, and the low interest rates then encourage investment. And of course, if you're not willing to go to low enough interest rates, which might include negative interest rates, that won't work very well, and you've got a problem. And so people are fixated on aggregate demand because in recent years, because central banks haven't been willing to go to low enough interest rates. But as soon as central banks are willing to go to deep negative interest rates, there is no shortage of aggregate demand anymore. Okay, that's a good place to do a wrap. Stay safe, and I'll do pretty soon one of these talking through the answer sheet on the 2019 final exam. Thanks for listening.